Hello, everyone. I see people are still joining in. Welcome to day 2 of Arab Center, Washington, D.C.'s 6th annual conference. The conference is titled U.S. Policy and Global Competition in the Middle East. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I am the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of the conference, starting first with the opening keynote session, which I will be moderating. This year, we at Arab Center Washington, D.C. decided to dedicate the annual conference to exploring U.S. policies and objectives in the Middle East and North Africa, especially in light of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and U.S. overall disengagement from the region. During these 3 days of the conference, we seek to assess the Biden administration's approach and US influence in the Middle East amidst growing global competition, as we see Russia and China continue to vie for power and influence through diplomatic, military, and economic means. Yesterday, as some of you might know and may have attended, was the first day during which we had 2 very, very good panel discussions, one focusing on the impact of global power dynamics on human rights and democracy and on empowering authoritarianism, and the second exploring the status of energy transition and geopolitical economic relations. The videos of these 2 panel discussions are on our website. Feel free to check them out if you missed the day yesterday at arabcenterdc.org. Today's panels, following this morning's opening keynote remarks, will focus on 2 also important issues: the ongoing conflicts in the region and the role of global and regional players in the humanitarian security conditions in those countries and on political processes and prospects. The second panel later today will address trends and objectives in international arms transfer, especially exports from US, Russia, and China to the Middle East, and the human cost of weapons sales in the region. The third and final day of the conference will be this Friday, September 17th. I am very pleased to announce that we will start with an opening keynote address by a spokesperson from the US Department of State. Joey Hood will be joining us to deliver the opening keynote remarks on Friday. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and he will give us an official American perspective on these issues that we're discussing during the conference. This will be at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Friday. This will be followed by a keynote delivering the Arab perspective on these issues, and this will be presented by Tariq Mitri, who is former special representative and head of the United States Support Mission in Libya, and he's a former Lebanese government minister. The keynote session on Friday will be also followed by 2 panels assessing US policy in Palestine, Israel, and US policy towards Iran. I invite you all to stay with us for these interesting and important conversations today and on Friday. Feel free to check our website for the full program and the list of speakers at arabcenterdc.org. Finally, before I introduce our keynote speaker for today, I would like to remind everyone you can submit your questions to the speaker at any time using the Q&A feature of Zoom. You can also send your questions by email if you wish to events@arabcenterdc.org. You can tweet and follow today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACW2021. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker who will kick off today's discussions, Dr. Ibrahim Fraihat. Ibrahim Freehat is an associate professor of international conflict resolution and is the Dean of Student Affairs at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He is also an non-resident fellow at Deakin University's Middle East Studies Forum in Australia. He previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at Brookings Institution and taught conflict resolution at Georgetown University and George Washington University. His latest books include Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict, and Unjustified Revolutions, Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia after the Arab Spring. Dr. Freehat has published extensively on Middle East politics, with articles appearing regularly in US and international media outlets. His research interests include conflict resolution and management, post-conflict reconstruction in the Arab world, national reconciliation, transitional justice, institutional reform, and political transitions in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Tunisia, among other things. Thank you, Ibrahim, for taking the time to be with us today and deliver the opening address. Dr. Freehat's remarks are titled Arab Expectations of US Policy in the Middle East, Hopes and Realities. Ibrahim, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you, the Arab Center, for this important and timely discussion. And just before I begin, a small correction, actually, the book is called Unfinished Revolution, not Unjustified Revolutions, because that takes it to a whole different meaning. With that, I will begin my my remarks on the subject that I was asked to talk about, to address, which is on US foreign policy, a view from the region, a view from the Middle East. And with that, the very first thing that came to my mind, the view of who? Because this region is still in transition. It depends on where you stand and the way you look at the foreign policy and the expectations from the US policy in the region. But nevertheless, I think there are certain areas. It doesn't matter where you stand. As an objective, independent researcher, you will have to look at these important points when you talk about the implications for US policy in the region and the expectations as a result of that. And let me begin with the most recent, which is the most recent development, which is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and how this affected the view of the region, of the Middle East, of US foreign policy and the relationship with the United States. The very first thing, the very first implication, and here I will talk about 5 points. The very first one is we're seeing vulnerable state building models built by the United States in the region, that these governments that the US is building, they're vulnerable, discredited governments, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Iraq before, or the Palestinian Authority also that came as a result after the Oslo Agreement. So these governments that are built lack the local legitimacy in where they are built. And the moment the US is leaving these areas, we are seeing these governments collapsing and also struggling to build legitimacy from within and the legitimacy with their own people. That's one. Second, I talk about the other implication, which is the abandonment of alliance. And here, as we saw, the United States leaving Afghanistan and leaving the Afghani government after the US withdrawal from them. And here, I would like, in my view, to emphasize that Kabul fell not in August 2021 with the American withdrawal on August 15. In reality, Kabul fell and the government collapsed back in February 2020, when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with Taliban, with the Taliban rebels, excluding their own allies, excluding the Afghani government. So that's in fact where the Afghani government felt excluded, abandoned, and started the struggle of its own legitimacy with its own people. So during this time, I mean, to expect that the Afghani government in August 2021 that would sustain itself, that was far from reality, because this is, again, going back to the region. This is not the first time where the United States abandons its allies. We saw this back in 2015 with the signing of the nuclear agreement with Iran, excluding also the traditional allies, US allies in the region, the Gulf countries. And that, as we know, that led eventually to deterioration of the security situation and then conflict escalation in the region. So here, in fact, for this to happen in Afghanistan and to watch how the US engaging with Taliban in direct negotiations and signing agreements without their closest allies, the Afghani government, being on the table or its interest being represented or on the agenda, this was not just scary for the allies or left them confused and vulnerable of their allies, but also it sustained a pattern since there are previous practices of US foreign policy in the Middle East, as we saw again in the region. And here it's important to think about the implications for this. And I think when we saw back in 2015, the direct implications was conflict escalation, which is, this is always possible. But on the other hand, I think this also could lead to other developments. And in particular, this could also lead to conflict de-escalation, not necessarily escalation, as we saw in the Iranian nuclear deal back in 2015. How? Because the allies, or the traditional allies of the US policy in the region, are more becoming aware that they have to rely on themselves, that this traditional ally in Washington to protect them and being the sole security vendor and providing all the security assurances that they used to enjoy in the past, they're becoming more aware that this is not necessarily the case going to be in the future. So, in fact, we have seen some developments on conflict de-escalation. We saw some not rapprochement, but close relationships being developed or evolving between Egypt and Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, even UAE and Turkey as well. So again, the other important implication to this, of this abandonment of allies, the parties are becoming, or the traditional allies becoming, more aware that they have to build their own security strategy that relies on themselves mainly, not depending on others like the United States and others. So it depends on, as I started talking about this, it depends on where you stand and how you look at things and the lessons that you will be drawing as a result of this. But again, the evident or the important fact that's emerging, that there is a pattern of US abandoning its traditional allies, and for that there are many lessons are being drawn. The third important implication, or the third important pillar, I would also say, as a result of this view, is that this US foreign policy that we're seeing in the Arab region is also leading to emboldened adversaries developing, the traditional adversaries, or with the United States also sending a message that there is a vacuum, a security vacuum is there as a result of the US withdrawal, and this needs to be filled by other parties. And here, I think the most relevant actors that are taking notes of this emboldenment of adversaries, we are seeing this in Iran, reflecting itself, in fact, in the most recent nuclear negotiations after the Ibrahim Fraihat being in power. And also we're seeing statements from Iran saying that we have just very recently, 2 days ago, talking about the need for a mechanism to verify that the United States is really committed to the agreements that that the US is making. We never heard about this before. And also, it's the attitude that also developing, why should I come negotiate with you since you are unable to defeat rebel fighters in Afghanistan, right, with the primitive weapons, right, like Taliban fighters? What, you are leaving the country without being able to sustain an ally there. So why should we be negotiating with you? Not only this, in fact, also we are seeing not only Iran, but also we are seeing this this attempt to fill the vacuum of more Turkey-Russia model of trying to present itself as resolving or managing at least conflicts in the region. We are seeing this in Syria, more of Turkey, Russia, reaching agreements and making arrangements. We saw it also in Libya as well, of more Turkey-Russia direct relations. And also, in fact, most recently also in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where we're seeing a Turkey-Russia arrangements is being enforced, is being implemented. And while the United States and Europe, right, becoming or less relevant or less important in the war or in the arrangement after the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The fourth element that I also would like to emphasize is about Arab liberals. And remember, the Arab Spring is never over. I think we are going through phases. We went through the first phase in 2011. Now, in 2019, we saw a second wave of revolutions in the Arab region, in Egypt, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, back in 2019. So this kind of revolution or calls for change, democratization in the region, they're also getting the message, Arab liberals, that you are on your own. Do not expect much from the United States. Do not expect that the United States, would do much in order for, to help with the democratization in the region and to do something with the Arab Spring. And we, in fact, saw this being mainly emphasized by the Trump administration that made arrangements and alliances with dictators in the region so clear. But then that the Biden administration coming to power and making commitment towards supporting democracy and human rights in the world, while we're seeing this, in fact, ignored to a large extent in the region. And the Biden administration main points here is that we're not supporting dictators, but we're not fighting dictators either, right? So on that level, also this kind of a clear message or a clear policy that Biden administration is making, this is also has been received in a very disappointing attitude here and in skeptical views about the level of commitment or the level of support that the United States could provide to this movement of democratization or human rights support in the region, as it's being clearly communicated and clearly emphasized in most of the US official statements about the support to democracy and human rights in the world, while this is not being seen in the region. And I end with the elephant in the room, with the fifth point, right, which is always Palestine, and which is the pillar or the scale where the credibility of any US government and the commitment to working with the region or the commitment to building peace in the region is tested. To what extent that this new government is doing something to support or to help on that level. And here I have to emphasize also is that, yes, there is an understanding, there is an appreciation that the aggressive, one-sided, oppressive conflict escalation Trump policy on deal of the century, what was called, that it's over. And it's no longer as part of the debate or the political debate with the arrival of the Biden administration. So there is this understanding and there is this appreciation, but at the same time, there is a huge disappointment on the level of the double standards. Again, while you make the commitments to supporting, again, human rights and democracy and peace and other in the rest of the world, you're ignoring this in Palestine and you are not doing even the minimum. And the second level of, or the second indicator for this double standard, where the US, where the Biden administration is seen as undoing a lot of the damage that the Trump administration created for the right reasons, yes, whether it's the Paris Protocol, climate protocol, or in any other agreements, that the Biden administration is investing heavily in undoing a lot of the damage that was created in the rest of the world. The Biden administration is not doing even the minimum on the damage that the Trump administration created in what I call is the the escalation of the conflict in Palestine or the perpetuation of this conflict on that level with the policy that he used or that adopted during that level. And here are a number of indicators. While such, for example, moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the position on the refugees or the settlements, none of this is being done by the Biden administration on that level, not even restoring or reopening the American consulate in Jerusalem. That on that level is not being done. So there is absolutely the minimum on that level, while avoiding the main points or the main damage that the Trump administration created on that level, and being shy from taking any serious, bold positions on this conflict, as it is again the case of taking these bold positions on the damage that the Trump administration created in other parts of the world. And here I will stop, and I thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for this very insightful and frank assessment of US policies in the Middle East and North Africa region. I would like to follow up with a question. So you've provided, these 5 points that are very interesting and eye-opening about, if you will, the failures of US policies in the region. In your assessment, what should the US be doing, if anything at all? And the kind of the other side of this coin, what should the Arab countries be doing as opposing to those failures?
Thank you. I think this is a really key question on understanding the relationship between the region, the Middle East, and the United States moving forward. And here I would like to emphasize again the fact, again, the disappointment from abandoning its allies. But this also, I will start with the Arab region, with the Middle East. I would like to start with is that this should be an eye-opening. It's a wake-up call. There are no justifications whatsoever is that you build your own national security strategy, where the main pillar of such a national security strategy is in the hands of an external government, right? And also is being or is subjective actually to domestic politics in the United States, depending on whose government, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic government in Washington, D.C., and how this is going to reflect itself on the policies or in the national security of the region. So I think this is fair also, as you asked about the US. I think this is fair also for the United States and for the US government itself, is that this blanket guarantee of Middle East governments, right, including dictatorships, of being provided and protected and provided with all the reasons to engage in all types of human rights abuses, is that being a traditional ally and providing the support, this should also end on the US level. Because I think we are at a point, we have an opportunity, is to have a more responsible relationship. And I think it's the time for this, for a responsible relationship between the region and the US government. That's fair for both, for the United States and for the region, because there are many lessons, as we started saying without repeating all what I talked about. Vulnerable government, discredited, lack local legitimacies, that they collapse after in less than 24 hours after the US withdrawal. This, Tamara, must end. It's the time to establish and build the foundation for a responsible relationship between the two parties.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We have a couple of questions in the last 2 minutes, so I'll just maybe relay maybe 2 or 3 questions and give you some time to respond to them. A couple of questions about undoing the damage of the Trump administration with regard to Palestine, Israel. One question asks, why do you think the Biden administration is hesitant to undo this damage by Kushner and Trump? And the second question, in your view, what should the Palestinian Authority do? What strategies should the PA adopt, given the hesitancy to undo the damages that the Trump administration has done? Question about China and Russia. Could they position themselves as the new protectors of the Gulf countries? And one more question really quick, we don't have a lot of time. Wouldn't a Pan-Arab Union similar to the EU provide greater stability? Or is that only an option for scramblers? That's what the person is asking. I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer those questions and provide some concluding remarks. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Tamara. Well, this question needs another conference probably to answer that. Let me start with Palestine, and I think this is really great question. One, I think why there hasn't been serious engagement by the Biden administration, I think for important reasons. The U.S. administration has its priorities. I mean, during the time, the health situation in the U.S. during the COVID-19, also, the relationships, the domestic relationships in the United States, and also the relationship with Russia and China and all of that. So there are definitely domestic and foreign policy priorities that are not helping the Biden administration, and this is understandable. But nevertheless, I don't think this is a justification, is to do the minimum or the, creating or undoing the damage, at least if you don't want to engage in peace building like the way that the Obama administration did, again, understanding the other priorities, but about the damage, you can't just leave this damage on levels of mainly Jerusalem and the settlements. The Trump administration take the most aggressive positions on these issues, right? While we're not seeing even the minimum by the Biden administration. And also another reason, also to continue to be fair and objective, I think also the Palestinian leadership bears a responsibility for not taking action. because we have the Palestinian divisions within the Fatah Hamas. We have no elections. Both governments, Fatah and Hamas, also struggle with local or domestic legitimacy on that level. So I think this is also another reason that also the Palestinian leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, bear responsibility or contribute to this reason. Now, the other question, if you allow me just in 1 minute touch on it, whether Russia and China will present themselves as the protectors of the region. I can answer on behalf of China, or at least not just my own analysis, from all the conversations that we had with Chinese officials and experts and all of that. The answer is no. And we will never aim to do this, right? And the answer we always got, we don't have neither the interest nor the capabilities to do so. So forget about us. Now, as for Russia, I think Russia is taking more of an opportunist approach, is that making very careful calculations about certain conflicts or certain areas. Wherever an opportunity presents itself and there is some potential on that level, we are seeing that Russia is stepping in on that level and to provide, yes, to fill some sort of the vacuum that the United States has created by its disengagement. So, but I do not think that Russia will present itself, at least in the near future, as the alternative protector or the alternative security provider in the region, that's in the Gulf or the rest of the Middle East, because Russia also understands its limitations. And we saw some engagement on that level in Libya, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, but after that, I think Russia thinks very well before extends its intervention in other areas.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And with that, we have reached the end of this first session of today's program. Many thanks to you, Ibrahim, for these excellent remarks and very eye-opening analyses. And thank you for your time. Thanks to all of you who joined us, and apologies to those whose questions we didn't get the chance to get to. Please remain online with us. Panel 3 of the conference, titled Complex and Greater Power Competition, which focuses on Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, will begin shortly. We will take a very short 5-minute break so we can transition to the next group of speakers. Please stay with us, and thanks again to Ibrahim.